It began with whispers among the crowd, parents pulling their children closer, pointing at the corner of the enclosure where Kano, the zoo's proud silverback gorilla, sat motionless. Day after day, the bananas, apples, and lush greens placed in front of him remained untouched. At first, some thought it was only a phase, but soon concern replaced curiosity. Something about the sight of a powerful creature refusing to eat felt deeply unsettling. Why would a gorilla suddenly stop eating? Could it be illness, or perhaps something much darker, emotional suffering? The truth, though harsh, was clearer than most wanted to admit. Gorillas, like humans, fall into deep states of grief and depression when mistreated or deprived of stimulation. And illness? The veterinarians had already ruled that out. This wasn't a matter of the body, it was the soul. Visitors leaned against the railings, whispering theories to each other. A mother told her child that maybe Kano was simply tired. A man muttered that the zoo wasn't taking proper care of him. Whatever the reason, the silence around Kano grew heavier with every passing day. He didn't roar, didn't pound his chest, didn't even acknowledge the voices calling his name. It was as if the world no longer existed for him. Children who once laughed and clapped at his playful jumps now stared with wide eyes, confused. How could a creature so strong look so broken? His broad shoulders slumped, his massive hands resting lifelessly on the ground. Even the younger gorillas in nearby enclosures seemed uneasy, their eyes darting toward Kano's corner as if they too sensed his despair. The zookeepers carried trays of fresh food, their boots clanking against the concrete path. Bright oranges, crisp lettuce, ripe bananas all ignored. Kano's gaze didn't even shift. He sat pressed against a cold wall, staring at nothing, retreating further inside himself as if waiting for something no one else could see. His silence spoke louder than any roar could have. Days turned into weeks, and the once lively gorilla became a shadow of himself. News began to spread, visitors sharing short clips online of Kano's refusal. The internet, quick to react, questioned if this was neglect. But behind the viral posts and speculations, the reality was harsher. Kano wasn't rejecting food. He was rejecting the life forced upon him. Some visitors tried calling out to him, whistling, even tossing food closer to the bars. Nothing worked. Kano never flinched. His dark eyes remained hollow, distant. He wasn't waiting for fruit or water, he was waiting for something that no tray could offer. Something he had lost, perhaps forever. The air around the enclosure became heavy, almost unbearable. People left in silence, some wiping away tears, others shaking their heads. The zoo may have presented Kano as a spectacle, but what the crowd witnessed now wasn't entertainment. It was heartbreak in its rawest form. A proud gorilla, once a symbol of strength, now quietly unraveling before their eyes. The uneasy silence around Kano's enclosure didn't go unnoticed by the staff. Most keepers avoided his corner, muttering about his stubbornness, until one man, known for his roughness, decided he had seen enough. His heavy steps echoed on the concrete path, his jaw clenched as if he were preparing for battle rather than care. Visitors pulled back slightly, sensing the tension rising even before he reached the bars. He slammed the metal gate with a sharp clang that reverberated through the enclosure. Kano flinched for the first time in days, not out of fear, but surprise at the violent sound. The keeper shouted his name with anger, his voice cutting through the quiet like a whip. Instead of speaking with patience or care, his words dripped with frustration. To him, Kano wasn't sad or broken, he was simply disobedient. The gorilla's eyes remained fixed on the ground, unwilling to meet the man's glare. That only made the keeper angrier. He lifted a tray of fruit and hurled it forward, apples and bananas bouncing off the dirt with a thud. "Eat," he barked, pounding on the bars once more. The aggression turned the feeding into a punishment, each gesture a reminder of control rather than kindness. Families in the crowd exchanged nervous looks. Children clutched their parents' arms, confused by the shouting. A few adults raised their phones, recording the scene with uneasy hands. No one dared to step forward, though the discomfort was almost unbearable. It wasn't just a keeper losing patience. It was a man unleashing power on a creature that could not answer back. Kano finally raised his head, his dark eyes glistening under the harsh afternoon light. For a moment he looked directly at the keeper, then slowly shifted his gaze to the scattered food on the ground. He didn't touch it. Instead, he leaned back against the cold wall, his expression unreadable, his silence louder than any defiance. That single act of refusal carried more weight than any roar. The keeper's frustration only deepened. He shouted again, pacing along the bars, trying to provoke a reaction. But Kano remained still, his chest rising and falling with slow, steady breaths. It wasn't disobedience. It was a quiet resistance, the kind that reveals pain hidden beneath strength. The audience held its breath, sensing something fragile yet powerful in that stillness. A woman whispered to her husband, "He's not refusing food. He's refusing him." The words spread softly among the onlookers, shifting their perspective. What they saw was no longer a gorilla acting strangely, but a gorilla making a choice. Every thrown fruit, every yell was a wound deeper than hunger. The crowd began to murmur louder, unease turning into indignation. Yet the keeper pressed on, blind to the shifting atmosphere around him. He banged once more, the sound echoing harshly through the enclosure. But the moment didn't belong to him anymore. All eyes were fixed on Kano, on the quiet defiance that made his suffering impossible to ignore. Something had begun to change, and though no one realized it yet, this scene would soon break far beyond the zoo walls. The following morning, the air around the enclosure was heavy with anticipation. News of the keeper's outburst had already spread among visitors, and some had returned hoping to see if Kano would react differently. The gorilla sat in his usual corner, still and silent, yet something about the way his eyes followed the keeper's suggested a shift. People pressed against the railing, phones ready, as if waiting for a moment they couldn't name. A tray of fruit was slid inside, the same way it had been the day before. Bright colors scattered across the dirt, apples rolling near his feet. For a long while, Kano did nothing, the crowd growing restless with each passing second. Then, with deliberate slowness, he reached out his massive hand. Instead of eating, he picked up a piece of fruit and held it with an unsettling gentleness. The keeper crossed his arms, muttering under his breath, certain that Kano was finally giving in. But what happened next silenced him, silenced everyone. Kano stood, walked to the bars, and placed the fruit carefully against the metal, as if handing it back. One by one, he repeated the gesture, returning each piece instead of consuming it. The action was quiet, precise, almost ceremonial. Gasps rippled through the crowd. A child whispered, "He doesn't want it." An older man shook his head, stunned. The gorilla wasn't rejecting food. He was rejecting the hand that had thrown it with cruelty. The meaning was undeniable, and the silence that followed was heavier than any shout. This wasn't animal instinct, it was choice. It was protest. Phones were lifted higher, recording every second. The footage captured Kano's dark, steady gaze, the way he turned his back on the fruit, the way he pressed himself against the wall with a dignity that cut through the air. Within hours, the video was online, and by evening it was everywhere. Hashtags trended, headlines began to appear, and debates erupted across platforms. Strangers who had never stepped foot in the zoo were now sharing his story. Comments poured in: outrage, sorrow, admiration. Some called him defiant, others heartbroken. The truth lived somewhere in between. The world was watching, and for the first time, Kano's silence was no longer hidden. His suffering had a voice, and that voice was spreading faster than anyone imagined. Back at the zoo, the crowd had shifted from passive onlookers to witnesses of something extraordinary. Whispers grew louder, anger mixing with awe. Some demanded answers from staff, others simply stood frozen, unable to process the weight of what they had seen. It wasn't just an animal returning food. It was a mirror held up to human cruelty, a moment too raw to ignore. Kano remained in his corner, calm and still, as if the storm beyond the bars meant nothing to him. Yet his actions had lit a fire no keeper could extinguish. The quiet resistance of one gorilla had crossed into the human world, and nothing inside those walls would ever look the same again. The tension inside the zoo had reached its breaking point. After Sarah submitted a detailed report about Kano's worsening condition, a team of animal protection investigators arrived unannounced. They carried cameras, clipboards, and a determined look in their eyes. Mark froze the moment he saw them walking toward the gorilla enclosure, his hands tightening nervously around his keys. Kano sat quietly in the corner of his enclosure, his ribs faintly visible, his eyes following the strangers with unusual focus. One of the investigators knelt down and whispered to Sarah, "This doesn't look like neglect by accident. This is deliberate." Sarah's heart sank as she realized her suspicions might be confirmed. Over the next hours, the team examined food logs, security footage, and medical records. The evidence painted a horrifying picture: meals intentionally withheld, water rationed, and unnecessary isolation. Mark had been abusing his power, taking his frustration out on the helpless animal. Each new discovery only fueled the investigators' anger. When questioned, Mark tried to deflect blame, claiming Kano was simply a difficult animal. But one investigator pulled out footage from a hidden camera, showing Mark shouting and kicking at the bars, deliberately intimidating the gorilla. The room went silent. Sarah clenched her fists, her face pale with rage as Mark realized he was trapped. News spread faster than the zoo could contain it. Local reporters gathered outside, broadcasting live as the story unfolded. Headlines began to flood the internet. "Starving gorilla in city zoo sparks outrage." Photos of Kano, weak yet dignified, circulated widely. Within hours, the world knew what had been happening behind the zoo's gates. By the next morning, crowds formed outside the zoo, holding signs that read "Justice for Kano" and "Shut down cruelty." Families, activists, and even former employees joined the protest. Chants echoed through the streets, demanding accountability. The sound carried all the way into Kano's enclosure, where he watched curiously, Unaware that the world was rallying for him, the pressure became impossible to ignore. Local authorities arrived with police officers and ordered Mark to step away from the enclosures immediately. As he was escorted out, protesters cheered, cameras flashed, and Sarah finally let out a shaky breath she had been holding for weeks. Justice was beginning to move in Kano's favor. Inside the enclosure, Kano finally received a full meal under Sarah's watchful care. He ate slowly, cautiously, his eyes scanning the unfamiliar faces of the investigators who now surrounded him. For the first time in days, there was calm in his movements. Though the scars of mistreatment lingered, hope had re-entered his world, and it was stronger than fear. Mark's punishment was swift. After a full investigation, he was officially removed from his position, arrested, and charged with animal cruelty. The once feared keeper who had controlled Kano's life with intimidation now faced the weight of the law. The sight of him being led away in handcuffs became a defining image for the protests, a symbol of long-awaited justice. The zoo itself could not escape scrutiny. Authorities ordered a complete review of its policies, from feeding schedules to staff training. Sarah was placed at the head of a new committee designed to ensure transparency and accountability. For her, it wasn't about repairing the zoo's image. It was about making sure no animal endured what Kano had survived. But the biggest decision came from the Animal Welfare Board. Kano would be transferred. After weeks of careful planning, a large truck arrived at the zoo to carry him to a wildlife sanctuary several hours away. As he stepped into the crate, his eyes reflected both uncertainty and the faint glimmer of hope. Sarah whispered a quiet goodbye, promising him a better life ahead. The sanctuary was unlike anything Kano had ever known. Instead of concrete walls and steel bars, he was greeted by tall trees, open spaces, and the sound of birds echoing through the air. Other gorillas watched him from a distance, curious but calm. For the first time in his life, Kano was not just surviving, he was entering a world built for living. At first he moved slowly, testing the grass beneath his hands, sniffing the air as if unsure it was real. Then, with cautious strength, he climbed a tree and sat high on a branch, scanning the horizon. Caretakers at the sanctuary recorded every step, amazed at how quickly his natural instincts returned. The once starved gorilla was rediscovering himself. Food was no longer a tool of punishment, but a gift of abundance. Kano devoured fresh fruits, roots, and leaves, his appetite stronger than ever. Soon he began to play with enrichment, toys, tugging at ropes, and rolling barrels with surprising energy. His powerful body, once weakened, grew stronger with each passing day, reflecting his resilience. The sanctuary staff noted his intelligence as well. Kano solved puzzles, figured out feeding challenges, and even learned to communicate simple requests with hand signals. Other gorillas slowly accepted him, and soon he was seen sharing food and lounging in the sun beside them. His quiet dignity became a source of inspiration for everyone who worked there. News outlets worldwide covered Kano's transformation. Videos of him climbing, eating, and bonding with his new family spread across social media, celebrated as a victory for animal rights. To millions, he was no longer just a gorilla, he was a survivor, a symbol of justice, and proof that dignity could be restored. At last, Kano lived surrounded by care, respect, and freedom. If Kano's journey touched your heart, make sure to subscribe to our channel so you don't miss more powerful Animal stories that remind us of the strength of compassion and justice.